The paranormal, UFOs, monsters, mysteries. You're listening to Talking Weird. And now, from a cabin deep in the Northwoods, your host, Dr. Dean Bertram.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Talking Weird on the Untold radio network. Another freezing night here in the North Woods. I think we're going to get to minus 30 wind chill factor tonight. So wherever you are, I hope you are staying warm. Hopefully this program will help you stay warm because I have a guest I'm very excited to talk with tonight. As everybody knows who's a regular listener to the show, over the last month or two, I've become quite obsessed with Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver and amazing stories, and we'll be touching on all of that tonight. The gentleman tonight, he's an animator and director from the Seattle area. He's most known for his award-winning short film, Fred Crisman, Cave of the Space Nazis, as well as an upcoming documentary on the same subject. He has an upcoming program called Toons Talking, where he and his animated companion critique movies both live and as cartoons. A sequence of strange events led him to the world of the weird, and he hopes to at least tell some interesting stories with the information he gathers. So I'm absolutely delighted to welcome to the show, Bryan Shickley. Good evening,
thanks
Bryan.
for having me. Hi.
It's great to have you here. Jeez, I love your film.
Well,
Fred Crisman.
did I show you the whole thing already?
You have, yeah, you have, and
that's
I haven't announced the short films yet at Midwest Weird Fest, but you will be being screened at the festival. So,
oh, that's cool.
oh, it's a great fest too. I'm just so delighted to have it. Now, I've got a trailer here for your film, but I thought we might play that in a minute because not everybody perhaps is as down with who Ray Palmer is and Richard Shaver and Fred Crisman's relationship with those two men. So I thought maybe you might want to fill us in on a little bit about Fred Crisman and his intersection with Palmer and with the Shaver mystery.
Oh boy, I should have come prepared for this. So if anyone knows anything about the Shaver mystery, there was my friend always described it as an era in storytelling where you were paid by the letter. So if you ever look at the cover for I think it's 34 is the Shaver mystery that Crisman was in, and it talks about the Deros. I remember asking my buddy, is this what a Deros looks like? And he goes, no, they would draw the covers first and then just type whatever to make it match. It was so free-spirited.
Fantastic.
There was a man who posted that he too saw the Deros in a cave, and his friend got shot in the shoulder. He had a dime-sized hole that was seared through. And then this man later went on to reveal his name as Fred Lee Crisman. And with time after that, we had the Kenneth Arnold incident where he saw the 6. They weren't discs, but they were chevrons, and these chevrons are flying over Mount Rainier. And this was Ray Palmer, right? Ray Palmer told him, "You need to interview Fred Lee Crisman. He just saw something very similar." Now this is when discs took over and flying saucers were the nomenclature. Crisman claimed that his associate Harold Dahl saw 6 flying discs right above their fishing boat. He was gathering logs that they could resell later. So Crisman has a bag full of material. He puts it in a cereal box of all things, gives it to Kenneth Arnold. Kenneth Arnold gives it to some men who were just starting the Air Force. It had just moved from the Army Air Corps to the Army Air Force. Or I guess just the Air Force.
It was very early days, I think. You're right. There was that kind of
yeah.
time where the Air Force was really part of the Army, and then it became its own branch of the armed services.
That's it. And it flew off from McCord. And then the engine exploded over Kelso, Washington. And I believe that the 2 pilots made it out, and then the other 2 men didn't survive. And with that became the living enigma known as Fred Crisman. He started a radio show, very Rush Limbaugh-esque. And then after that, said some very naughty things about President Kennedy being a commie. And suddenly when Kennedy's head exploded on on when Mr. Zapruder became the most successful indie filmmaker of all time. Fred subpoenaed by Jim Garrison, and you can look up all those transcripts. But the man basically spent up until his death, I would say, smirking about how much cred he had in the world of the weird.
I think, wasn't he accused of being one of the 3 tramps which were arrested near
Yep.
Dealey Plaza on the day of the assassination? And there were conspiracy theorists who suggested that they were the shooters. And allegedly
Yes.
there was, I don't know if Crisman really was one or not. I'm sure he probably wasn't, but that was the rumor, right? Or the accusation.
Mm-hmm. And I actually have audio. I've been really digging for my own Crisman projects, but I have Jim Garrison saying, "I'm pretty sure the third man is Fred Crisman, and we're gonna fly him out."
Oh, wow.
Right?
That's fantastic. It's wonderful when you're a documentarian and you discover those kinds of things.
That's just crazy, man.
But I don't know how much you can say. I believe you're actually talking to a Crisman relative for the documentary.
A couple of them, actually. I'm fortunate to have a good relationship with them.
Wow.
I can say I'm speaking. Oh, sorry.
No, you go.
Oh, I'm speaking to his son, and his son basically saw the movie and said, "Hey, are you making fun of my dad?" And I said, "Yeah," and he goes, "That's pretty funny." And
What does his
guy.
son think about all the Crisman mythology, like the Deros story and the Maury Island incident and the later JFK assassination accusations?
I don't think he's particularly a believer of the paranormal, but he said it's about as true as anything else his dad would tell him. His Crisman Sr., the one we're talking about, is actually he was a very talented writer. I have several letters. He would, when he was off, he was out of town, he would send his daughter bedtime stories every week. And he'd write out a couple of pages handwritten, just little stories for his kids.
Huh.
I always thought, and he submitted to Amazing Stories, I always thought he would have been a great fiction writer. Or nonfiction, but
Maybe he was both or neither, or who knows. I mean, it's that weird kind of space in between the real and the unreal. With all your research on Fred Crisman, have you formed an opinion yet as far as the reality or lack of reality of any of his
No.
claims or any of the...
that's the fun of it is, I could go on for hours.
Please do.
I don't have an opinion exactly. I don't think he killed Kennedy. He might have seen a UFO. His grandson showed me this document where they said they found a warehouse full of not UFO parts, but let's call it slag. They literally used the word slag a couple of years ago. There were several crates of some sort of unidentified flying object slag. So there is a little bit of credibility there, but like with the shoulder and all that, there's a lot of varying stories. In fact, the other Crisman cartoons that I'm writing, every week he gets hit in the shoulder for a different reason. And then explains, that's how I got my trusty shoulder scar. Uh-oh. You're on mute.
Thank you.
There you go.
We were just talking about, regarding the Maury Island incident slag, which supposedly spewed out of a troubled saucer which was hovering above Crisman and Dahl's boat near Maury Island. I believe Ray Palmer supposedly had a piece of that slag up into his death, and it might still be within the family now. I also know that I think there's a story, it might be in one of Richard Toronto's books, where he tells where when the FBI came to interview Palmer after that event, Palmer thought it was very funny that he was using a piece of the slag as a paperweight and they didn't realize or something.
They also, Crisman used it as an ashtray, so the rumor goes, if you ever read Ken Arnold's book.
Yeah, I do. I have Coming of the Sources, actually. I need to reread it. It's such a good book. And there's another great book by Ken Thomas on the Maury Island incident as well, right?
Mm-hmm. I have 2 of them.
Oh,
I got both, and then I got Murder of a City, Crisman's actual book, which contains no UFO stuff at all.
Wow. I didn't even know about that book. I need to get my hands on that and read that as well. Was it widely published, or was it a privately published book, that Crisman
Locally published. It's got a real charm to it. Spoilers for the documentary, but we're the Crisman family and I we're going to republish the book. Maybe not for money, but to recreate something like that was made with old typesetting.
Uh-huh.
the letters go up and they go down and they're wavy and wobbly. I mean, it's very amateurish production. So we're actually going out of our way to copy it line for line and make it have that authenticity, misspellings, and
Wow,
it's
that's
a
fantastic.
fun read.
I'm buying a copy of that when you launch it. Do like an Indiegogo or Kickstarter or something. I bet you get.
Maybe we should.
Seriously, I bet you get lots of people like me who'd want to get it. What made you interested in Fred Crisman originally? What kind of brought you to this subject matter?
Are you familiar with the Maury Island movie?
You know what? I'm conscious of it. I believe I never saw it. I used to run a festival in Sydney, and I think one of my programmers there saw it, but didn't tell me about it at the time. I'd love to see it though. I've seen some of the footage borrowed by, I think, some History Channel reenactments or something. I think it must have got licensed out, but I haven't seen it. But yeah, please tell me a little bit about that movie.
So there's two producers, Scott Schaefer and Steve Edmiston, and they were instrumental in trying to make Crisman. Crisman and Dahl make him a big piece of UFO history. And one of the things they did is they started a T-shirt campaign called Dahl Did Not Admit, because he never did say that he was lying. He said that if I'm ever asked again, that's what I'll say. And they actually helped instigate Maury Island becoming a nationally known event, specifically a locally known event, and they have a big UFO festival in Burien to celebrate the spreading of the information of this kind of stuff. And I saw the movie and thought it was marred by visual effects issues. I worked on my own cut for a while that we never ended up using. That was all black and white to kind of... I think it had a different kind of charm to it. It's a very serious movie. And we were looking into if you did a second one, it would have to be about their event in the hotel where they're getting phone calls describing what they're doing, and Crisman checks around to see if somebody's bugged the room, because Crisman had experience with that, or so we're told. And we realized on Crisman's Wikipedia page it says he claimed to fight space aliens in a cave in World War II, and I'm like, that's a movie. And better yet, that's animated. It sounds like Evil Dead. Picture Evil Dead but animated, and picture it being like a pseudo-historical. Suddenly that became all I wanted to do.
Fantastic.
And I graduated college. I have a bachelor's in animation and a minor in film, and I can do all this fun stuff. Really hard to get hired in the animation industry. I think like 4,000 people this year lost their jobs because they're doing cutbacks in every network. And right before that happened, COVID hit, and I said, I'm doing this movie.
Well, the world's a richer place for the movie. It's so much fun. I'm looking so forward to the other ones, because you're going to make a series of them, right? You were saying. So it's going to be a lot of fun. Can you tell me something I found kind of amusing when I watched it? Obviously, the Richard Shaver character in there looks a lot like Richard Shaver, like he does, but the Ray Palmer character doesn't look a thing like Ray Palmer, and that's obviously intentional. Can you tell me a little bit about what the motivation was behind that?
I was trying to think of what a movie-esque Raymond Palmer looks like. One that wasn't the Atom. I didn't want to do something where I made a completely different product that was inspired. But I thought it would be really funny if Crisman's saying just crazy nonsense, and then Peter Dinklage or someone similar is responding to him. And we're looking at people who are under 5 foot, and Peter Dinklage was kind of a good inspiration. And I sort of ended up giving him Doc Brown hair. But... oh, that guy's really funny, too. He does video announcements.
Yeah, he seems like a mad scientist almost in the cartoon. It's kind of that feel. So maybe that's the hair.
I sort of thought of him as maybe not as... maybe as Crisman's Moneypenny. He sends him out on missions.
Yeah, it was becoming a little bit like that. And I guess it's so strange, that intersection between Palmer and Crisman, that two of the most significant, arguably the Shaver mystery is the most significant, but the two of the most significant early UFO incidences both have Palmer and Crisman involved. A is obviously the cave story where he fights the Deros, Crisman does, so that becomes part of the mythology. And later, of course, the Maury Island incident, which is what brings together not just Crisman and Palmer, but also Kenneth Arnold, the world's first flying saucer witness, all coalesce around this story. It's such an intriguing part of UFO history, which has been almost written over. It's not something which gets talked about a whole lot by the UFO community. I mean, Maury Island's usually still kind of dismissed as hoaxy. And I think regardless of whether it's hoaxy or not, it's such an important origin story almost of all of this.
Well, and to talk more about Palmer looked for other shavers. I think he wanted more shaver mysteries. And it's weird to think that without him, we may not have UFOs identified as saucers. We may not have UFO. They weren't always associated with aliens. Kenneth Arnold at the time believed it could have been maybe not Russians, but someone not of this country. And certainly with time, it became not of this earth. And a lot of conspiracy, at least what you'd think you'd believe would be, it's easier for a man to believe that a space alien could make a craft than someone from another place besides the good old US of A. And I don't think Palmer ever found someone quite like... I would have pressed into Crisman hard and just kept having Crisman stories. He was a very talented guy. He was arguably a NEET. I did this really good interview with a UFO researcher who said, if you don't know what a NEET is, not educated or in training for anything career-wise, he didn't have much of a career other than spinning these UFO stories. I don't know what I'm getting at anymore.
As far as Crisman, you mean, that's all that he was doing was spin these kinds of stuff. There's also, of course, rumors that Crisman was somehow intelligence and was sent out to make the whole shaver mystery and the whole UFO thing seem ridiculous and to shut it down early on. I don't know. Have you heard those stories? Or
I've heard them, but I think it's funny that Crisman's stories are so out there. Like, it's his job. He worked at Boeing for a bit. His son said that he would leave before the sun came up, and then he would go home when the sun came down. He then later, Crisman Sr., the one we're talking about here, he actually tried peddling the story, and this is hearsay. I have no source on this. I've read it in a few books. He tried peddling the Maury Island incident as Boeing dumping toxic waste. Now, if I were Crisman, I mean, no one would have believed me anyway. You might as well tell it any way you can. I went to Maury Island this summer for the documentary, and
wow,
I gotta say, it is weird how many barrels of just random crap I found, because there was a point they were just dumping there. Now, I don't know. I don't think they were dumping toxic waste, but...
Were you walking along the beach looking for old slag back from the Maury Island incident?
Have you seen I think it was not Ancient Aliens, what's the other one? There's a UFO show where they actually went to go find the slag, and they just sent a guy in a wetsuit down.
I might have seen it, actually. I might have seen that.
It's pretty funny. I did talk to I'm trying to remember who this is. I believe it's William Beatty, the professor. I saw him at a Buryan UFO festival where he had a piece of the slag, or so he claimed. And I went to the UW, which I'm not far from, University of Washington, and I found his little underground area. He has this really nice... He fixes computers and just spends the rest of the time doing cool stuff. He got a Geiger counter, like a Geiger meter, and he went over the slag, and he's like, watch this. This is a radium watch. Beep, 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 beep. And he's like, all right, not radioactive. And the big disconnect with that is we don't know if the material is the material. A kid found it roughly the same time and claimed that it matched the description. But we got to test it and do some fun stuff with it, and I got some really good footage of the material, whatever it may be. I'd love to see the Palmer stuff.
Oh wow, yeah. I've heard, but I mean, don't quote me on this. I do think that his family had a piece of the slag still post his death. Is from what a little bird told me, but I can neither really confirm nor deny that. That's just what I've heard. What does fascinate me is in Amherst, which isn't very far from me. That is where Richard Shaver, speaking of weird esoteric artifacts, that's where he first got interested in rock books. It was on his farm there, because Shaver moved to a town called Lanark right near Amherst. I don't even think it really is a town, it's a little area, and then he encouraged Palmer to move there. So it was Shaver who went there first, and Palmer followed him. But it was, I believe, Shaver's wife Dottie, who one day was out in the field and came back with some rocks and said, look at this looks like, a baby's foot petrified or not. And then whatever reason, Shaver just became obsessed with these rock artifacts, and that's where he starts doing his rock books, where he's, you know, he cuts these rocks in half and he sees all this imagery which he believes was put there by an ancient civilization. So that just started down the road from me, which I find all this fascinating. These almost forgotten byways of ufology, you know.
Just think of it from a sleazy Hollywood perspective, because that's what I've been trying to do. You're taking all these stories that no one's buying the rights to. Spielberg doesn't want this part of Amazing Stories. You can take that and make something out of it.
Well, I think initially what fascinated me, I guess, was the mystery and the development of the mythology around flying saucer belief, really, and how central all of these people were to it. Particularly Ray Palmer, who's probably the focus of my interest, but Shaver and Crisman, and there was obviously Arnold. All of these people have a part to play. But the more I look at it, what becomes increasingly interesting to me is the actual saga of these people as people, like their relationships and the lives they lived. And when you read the Shaver backstory, which I didn't really know anything about, except maybe he'd been in a mental hospital. I knew that. And when you read the Palmer backstory and realize how much he'd suffered with his accident as a child and how much time he'd spent in hospital, you realize that both these men, both Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver, both of them had around 10 years each in institutions where they probably had nothing to do but think, you know, and develop their imagination and develop these stories. And it's terribly tragic, really, because neither of them had a wonderful backstory. By the time you hit the Shaver mystery, both of them have suffered terribly by that times in their life. But it was that suffering which really essentially created modern UFO belief. I mean, if you take the tack of John Keel, as I tend to do, that Ray Palmer's the man who invented flying saucers. And as you might know, even the FBI, who investigated around the time of the Maury Island crash, when they were looking at, when they were going to interview Shaver and Palmer, I know they interviewed Shaver, I think they did, I know they interviewed Palmer, there's a redacted report, and you can see that you've probably read it, you're probably conscious of it, you can see the agent who wrote that report is suggesting that this whole UFO business, this whole flying saucer business is somehow just being, you know, beaten up or encouraged by Ray Palmer and Richard Shaver to sell the Shaver mystery stories. So even people at the time were like, this seems like these guys at the heart of all of this. And you can't blame people for thinking that. When you look at how front and center Amazing Stories was before the flying saucer mystery and after it broke, how they just pushed it so hard. And of course, then Palmer goes on to pay Kenneth Arnold to go and investigate Maury Island, and he pays Kenneth Arnold for his early reports, and then he founds Fate magazine. And so he's really beating the drum of flying saucers, as you said before, when most people in America are still thinking, well, it's probably our secret technology or the Ruskies' secret technology or just some misidentification or hoax. It's Palmer who's saying this is from the Deros, or this is from outer space, or this is from somewhere else. This isn't ours in any sense of the word. So to understand the mythology, you almost have to understand the people. And that seems to me, anyway, this is a long point of getting to my question. That seems to me to be maybe what you're doing with Crisman as well. You're trying to understand the man somewhat in these documentaries.
I think that's true. And I think the animation catches it too. We wrote a segment for a later one, for the Maury Island one, where my friend said, if Crisman's near a house, he's sleeping in his office. If Crisman's got an office, he's sleeping in the closet. If Crisman's got a closet, he's sleeping in the floorboards. And my Crisman's not the real guy, but I think I capture that spirit. And there is that, maybe not sleaze, but that lack of believability and just the weird characterizations. I mean, Palmer and Shaver, I mean, you know this, but they moved next to each other basically. And for the remainder of their lives, they stayed neighbors and close friends, and they died within about a year of each other. And there's something, if you ever saw Ed Wood, it kind of reminds me of that, where you get all these people who just aren't quite fitting in. And they find something in each other, and regardless of if the story's true, I'm not bored by it.
No, I think it literally is one of the most amazing stories, pun intended, I've ever read. Like, I was always interested in it. When I wrote my PhD dissertation on UFO belief back in the early 2000s, I kind of, accepted the John Keel line because it made sense. It still does. Like, it was quite clear when you read Coming of the Sources and when you look at the Shaver mystery stuff and you look at his involvement with Palmer's involvement with Shaver, with Crisman, with with Kenneth Arnold. It seems very clear that so much of that mythology that now is type of almost popularized X-Files belief, from Men in Black to UFO crashes to conspiracies that'll kill people, it all comes out of essentially these men writing their stories and telling their stories. But when you read a lot of UFO history books, for example, what's David Jacobs' book, UFO Controversy in America, which was probably the most important UFO history book back in the day. I think Ray Palmer appears in one footnote. I think his name's written like once in a footnote in that entire book. Like, to write Palmer and to write Shaver and to write Crisman, to write those guys out of the history, it's to me, knowing the story even better now than I did then, because I'm still, neck deep in research, it's unforgivable for an academic to just gloss over it. They were so important. So I'm so happy that you're making your documentary, that you're making these fantastic animations, because it brings attention back to it.
Well, there was a discrepancy with the Maury Island incident. I heard it described as someone took the Crisman story and added a bunch of lies to it and passed it off as a movie, which I think is a really harsh way to put it. But if you ever watch anything biographical, I mean, what was the Bohemian Rhapsody? They made Freddie Mercury late for work every day as like a running gag, and that just wasn't something that happened. They just wanted to write that in there. Or Ed Wood meets Orson Welles. I mean, that probably didn't happen. He didn't meet him at a bar right when he needed that pick-me-up. But right. But I wanted to do the Crisman documentary kind of as an apology, because I added a bunch of crazy nonsense to, the real story Crisman said is I saw something in a cave and it was very spooky. My version is, and by the way, they had ray guns and I got one and I beat all the Deros up and then I set the ship to self-destruct. And I think a lot of that is part of history. I think part of history is what do you want to call it, an evolution, where someone hears something third, fourth, fifth, sixth hand, and the details get a little different. And I think there's something interesting about taking a story and doing that, but I think there also has to be something to be said for making a, there's not enough info on Crisman. If that movie comes out, if I got to make a whole Crisman show, I would be remiss if I didn't at least go, also, this really happened here and this wasn't real, right?
Well, it's good that you take that attitude. Not many people do. And on that note, we should play the trailer for Fred Crisman. What's the title of it? It's Fred Crisman, Cave of the Space Nazis. So let me play that trailer and then we'll dissect it. And maybe you can tell the audience who don't know what Deros are, because they're about to see some.
I am meeting with a man who is by no stretch of the imagination shy about his claims.
My name is Fred Crisman. I'm a real person.
Deros must reign supreme.
I'm in the business of collecting and archiving amazing stories.
I think he's dead. Oh my God!
Do you know what minerals the cave was composed of?
20% limestone and 80% space Nazi monsters! There is no I in team, but there is always a man in Crisman.
Just fantastic. So we see some Deros there in that.
Yeah. I haven't watched this in 6 months. That's pretty funny.
It's hilarious. I mean, I can remember when I didn't know it had been submitted to the festival yet. And I think I was over on Richard Toronto's Shavertron Facebook page, just creeping over there. And I saw an image, I think, from your film and people discussing. And I'm like, this would be perfect for Midwest Weird Fest. I've got to reach out. And then I went and looked in the submissions. And I'm like, well, I don't have to reach out now because fantastic. It's been submitted. But we'll get to some of the humor of that in a minute. But tell people what the Deros are, because again, not everybody knows the story today.
So long before humans, there were two alien races. There's actually one. And they evolved over millions and millions of years to two separate races. which I believe is also the Morlocks and the Eloys from The Time Machine. This is a familiar science fiction concept, but there were the good ones, the ones who built the technology and they made sure that human evolution went the way it should, and they shepherded us, and they come from their home planet, which the what is it, it had a shell around it like a big M&M that kept the sun's dangerous rays away. Once they came to Earth, half of them started devolving into, let's call them inbred space Nazi monsters. It's almost like when people describe how society got when Grand Theft Auto or rock and roll happened. They became predicated on their most evil basic instincts, and they became inbred, vicious, disgusting. There's a lot of stories that kind of indicate them as people of different lineages or almost half human, but really they're sort of a composite of everything that's wrong with the world, and those are what are known as the Deros. Now the good ones are the Teros, so don't get those two mixed up.
You're right, and the Deros still, even though they're this ancient kind of race, they're still meant to interfere with us constantly. Tamper, I think, was the term that Shaver used to use.
There was some myth about Finnegan's Wake being written by a man who was mind needled by the Deros' rays.
Wow, I did not know that.
Have you ever read Finnegan's Wake?
I'm aware of it. I don't want to lie and say I have read it.
You'll get a page into it, and you'll think it was worth $10.
And you'll be like, the Deros are right there.
What do you think a Dero would sound like?
That one with the elephant trunk makes you think, the elephant trunk nose, the famous image, makes you think they'd be a little nasally, maybe, kind of very goblin-y, maybe.
I can see if I have a Dero head somewhere in here. Let me look real quick.
Oh, you do? Fantastic.
I might. No promises. I'm gonna look really quickly.
Yeah, take your time. This is worth waiting for if we're going to get to see a bust of a Dero.
I have a really disgusting Dero head somewhere in my house.
The funny thing is, in Australia, we used to call, it sounds horrible, but the same way in America they might have called homeless people bums. We used to call them in Australia Deros, meaning derelict, like it was an abbreviation for derelict. If somebody was hopeless and didn't have any job prospects and lived on the streets, they'd be called derelict, and it got shortened to Deros. So the first time and I'd been raised with that term in Australia, the first time I ever saw the word Deros actually written, I'm probably always mispronouncing it anyway. I hear people say Dero, Deros, Deros. I guess Deros is plural and Dero is singular.
I don't think it matters.
That's all right. We'll get you back on the we can get you back on the show another day to find as an excuse to show that head, which is all good. That's okay.
One more spot.
Okay, you can. Well,
here we go.
I should have had some of my.
That is worth waiting for.
It was worth waiting. I'm about to see that.
My girlfriend wrapped. We were building a costume, so I have something I know to draw, and if I need a pose for a Dero. My girlfriend built the...
Don't ever let that girl go, man, if she's making you a Deros mask. Is it Dero plural? Should I be saying Dero when I'm talking about that? I mean,
I
singular
say Deros in the show. I say Deros because I think it sounds neater as a singular plural. Like, no matter what, it's a good Deros or a bad Deros. I believe it's just Dero, and the other problem is it's so confusing. There's also the abandoned Dero, which is another terminology in the Shaver mystery, and that's all one word. I don't know what that means.
I think the Dero are abandoned Dero, right? But I also think maybe the Tero are abandoned Dero as well. That's the weird thing. I think both Tero and Dero are abandoned Dero, but Dero are different to Tero. It is quite confusing, Shaver's own little language for all this stuff.
And my movie screws it all up, too, because Shaver came up with the word Dero, if I recall. In the story, he came up with it because it's a portmanteau of detrimental robots. I could be completely wrong. But
yeah, that's correct. It is a Shaverism. Yeah.
And what was I gonna say? Crisman says it in the movie too. It's a deformed in robots, of which they are neither, but I didn't name them. Oh, I want to give shout out to Pat Cashman because I did 2 projects. I had 2 projects lined up. One was going to be Crisman. The other was the told about the plane trip with DB Cooper, and it would have had little interstitials where, if you've ever seen, the little packets in the airplane that'll show you all your exits and little stick figures.
Mm-hmm.
Half of it would have been that, but with DB Cooper wearing little sunglasses and explaining his plot, and then he'd tell little stories that, kind of like the Joker, he would tell you a story that wasn't quite true. He'd tell the next guy a story, and you get to kind of pick and choose. And I contacted a few actors. I got a personal no from Robert Englund, which was really flattering. And then Pat Cashman was the only voice I had in there for Crisman. And so whichever one got a bite, I would have. And the Crisman, just writing one person, Pat Cashman was like, I want to do it. I love cartoons. Let me do it. And he's the coolest guy ever.
It's a great voice. It works so well for Crisman. And I love that it can be in... No, you go.
Oh, I was going to say, I have one of the only audio recordings of Crisman. And he sounds like Art Bell.
Get out.
And I can send that to you if you want. It's
I would love to hear it.
Oh, I could send it now if you want to hear it, or do you want to wait?
You could send it now. My internet's so slow I probably couldn't upload it during the show, though. I live in a cabin in the woods, so I don't have the greatest internet, but I personally want to hear it myself.
Oh, it's really
very
neat.
much
and,
so. Is it one of his shows?
Yeah, it's one of the John Gold programs. He promotes a vitamin tonic in it, and he talks about his book. He shills for his book. Here, I'll send you.
How'd you find it? Where was it? How did you track?
Only
that
his
down?
family had a copy of it. Only his family had a copy of the tape, and I actually went in. I got a copy of RX-9 loaned to me, which is this. It's the software they use to restore like old Orson Welles movies, and I ripped the sound out that wasn't Crisman talking.
I can see. Thank you for.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it come through. Maybe I'll have to play some of it for the audience at another time. Just
sure.
Did he ever go on to say he was interfered with by the Deros in a day-to-day life, the way that Shaver was consistently haunted, or did he just have the story that he fought them in the cave?
He had a second story that I could find. Now, I think he wrote more for Fate, but I actually have not ever read a single issue of Fate. That's my next project, I think. He claimed that he lost his best friend Dick. He said, Dick died, Dick's gone. There's nothing left for me, and that's all I'm going to tell you about Alaska unless you commission more stories, Mr. Palmer, or something along those lines.
It'd be wonderful to be a fly on the wall back in those days when Palmer was making his decisions on what to run or not what to run. Like what was he thinking about? I mean, he was a genius. I think what fascinates me about Palmer was that, as you're probably aware of, the hardcore science fiction fandom of the day, which was only a couple hundred geeks who lived in their, parents' basements anyway, but they despised Ray Palmer because he had all of this kind of actiony Western, as he called it, science fiction, which would be, people, Buck Rogers style stuff, people shooting ray guns and beating each other up. And while the more cerebral... Yeah, exactly. Well, all the more cerebral fans wanted science fiction based on science with scientific principles. And of course, that wasn't Palmer's thing at all. So there was a big movement in the sci-fi fandom to get rid of him, but essentially deplatform. It was cancel culture before we had cancel culture today. And they succeeded. They actually got the Shaver mystery banned. They actually petitioned Ziff Davis so strongly. And Ziff Davis eventually caved and said, Palmer, there's no more running the Shaver mystery. But then on the other side, so he gets beat up on that side by the sci-fi fans. But then over in ufology, when he's totally, primarily a flying saucer guy, arguably the man who invented flying saucers, he becomes somewhat of a pariah there as well, because the whole Deros from beneath the earth, or the other more metaphysical interpretations that Ray Palmer posited at different times for flying saucers, wasn't kind of popular in that, again, scientific hungry NICAP type movement, the UFO investigators who want the scientific doors to open and welcome them in and think this is all explainable as, extraterrestrials visiting us from afar. So he was almost, he was in a way ignored by both sides eventually. So he isn't often recorded as important a science fiction figure that he was. And he certainly isn't as recorded often as the important UFO, figure that he was. So
I kind of think of it like religion, where people say religion's a salad bar, you take what you need from it. I think Palmer's mistake was mostly leaning hard into concrete theories. He didn't just go, what is this thing in the sky? He went, these are Deros. I want to know exactly what the Deros are doing with their computers under the, well, not computers, but what they were doing with their mind-needling devices under the ground and their floating probes. Deros had drones, which is kind of interesting. I believe Shaver's first interaction is he saw like a spherical drone and he could make it go in and out of the underground realms. And I think the biggest mistake was other people getting involved in saying, this isn't just Shaver, this is the hollow earth. And if you've heard any Deros stuff, there's always some sort of implication that it has something to do with the earth being hollow, which it doesn't. They were in caves. And I think that was actually corrected by Palmer and Shaver later in history, but they sort of got latched onto this hollow earth, what do you want to call it, subculture, subgroup.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll never read a piece of fiction where they go, the earth is hollow. They just say, we had these encounters that we can't explain. But I think when they started making a platform for other people to tell their stories, they pulled away from the I don't know if I'm making sense at all. They pulled away from the Deros side of it, and they focused a lot more on the crafts.
Mm-hmm.
And they pulled away, and other people who were still clinging to the culture of Raymond Palmer and Shaver, they tried to drag it into Hollow Earth. So no matter what, they were kind of being pulled by different ends, and it's kind of weird because I don't think of them quite as lost to history, but they are sort of cemented in a certain corner of it.
Yeah, I think you're right as far as that kind of urge by people who believe in subterranean origins of the flying saucer phenomenon tend to, particularly probably post the Shaver mystery into the 60s and the like, in the 50s into the 60s, people who believed in that did tend to lump it all in with hollow earth theory. There seems to be at least a component of that belief that doesn't differentiate between the Shaver mystery and hollow earth theory. But you're right. Palmer and Shaver were never suggesting that the earth was hollow and there was another world inside it on, the other side of the crust. It was that there are these enormous caverns, and that's just where these Deros and Teros, hid from the sun's rays and still live and continue to be involved either to help man in the case of the Teros or detrimentally in the case of the Deros. But I see your point too, as far as where could these guys go? Where could Shaver and Palmer go? And it did become, I think Shaver just disappeared into his rock art, and it wasn't that he stopped believing in the other things, but he just refocused on this was something physical he could demonstrate as proof of an older, or at least to him, proof of an older, civilization. It wasn't just him writing stories anymore. And I think Palmer just kept, beating various esoteric drums. He got interested in other types of, I suppose, esoterica and almost new age beliefs. And although he stayed obviously vested interest in flying saucers, he was no longer at the front and center necessarily of, pushing that kind of line.
He was kind of the Kevin Feige of UFOs to some degree. I mean, he really was like, this is my unidentified cinematic universe. He really liked to hold on to that, and I don't think he ever found a niche to go back to after that. Oh, another thing that historically has been kind of messed with, I can't find other than Coming of the Saucers, I can't find any reports of a man in black talking to Crisman. And I think Dahl. And I think from my understanding what may have actually happened is someone in a suit took them out to breakfast and told them to shut their mouths. But a couple years later with Coming of the Saucers, and then they, who did they knew too much about flying saucers?
Gray Barker.
Gray Barker. Yeah, that's when that started solidifying the Man in Black lore.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it's one of those things that the blender of history just kind of shuffled it all together.
Yeah, it's certainly I think the terminology Men in Black comes from Albert Bender's experiences, which were popularized by Gray Barker. But the tone of UFO silences was there from originally in the Kenneth Arnold, Ray Palmer book, as you mentioned, Coming of the Sources. So you're right. A lot of this stuff does blend in. And I should say, yeah, I don't think it's necessarily been forgotten to history. You're correct there. It's just been marginalized to such a degree that you'll find out about it if you go to the effort to read like one of the fantastic books by Richard Toronto. And there's also, is it Ralph Natus wrote another bio on Palmer, and there's it appears in various books, but it isn't. You could be a UFO believer today. In fact, I know for a fact when I did my PhD research in America, and I toured various UFO events and Roswell UFO museums, Area 51 tourist traps, and went to different conferences, and I had a questionnaire that I would encourage attendees and UFO writers and other people to fill in. So I guess I kind of, was both doing interviewing research, and I was also out there questionnaering, I guess. I had one of the things is, what do you think, the UFO entities are or something? And one of the things I had was Deros. Admittedly, this was back in the late 1990s, but very few people even knew what that was. In fact, I remember I was at Fort Fest and I was talking to Doug Skinner, and there was, I think, an attendee, a female attendee, was very kindly filling in one of my forms because I was standing near an info desk or something, and she actually stopped and asked, "What are these?" And Doug Skinner, who's quite an expert on the whole, on shaverism, stepped in for me and explained what they were. But it was something regularly people would say to me, "I don't even know what that is." And I think today it would be the same. Well, there has been the occasional ancient aliens that might have mentioned them, or a footnote of a book, or if you go to the trouble of reading something like the wonderful books, again, Richard Toronto's written, I think you can find out. But I would guarantee most people who believe in UFOs today have no idea about this backstory. None.
Well, and it's interesting because when did the Greys take over? Even the Barney Betty Hill, which is one of my favorite pieces of lore, I mean, that got me into all this sort of research. Betty didn't describe them as Greys until the second or third hypnosis session. And my understanding being that the thoughts either became clearer or her brain kind of sharpened into what the popular culture was demanding. Now, I have a good theory on... This isn't my theory, and I can't credit whoever did it. There's a theory going around right now that gray aliens are actually a composite of what an infant would see when a doctor is examining him. So a lot of these half thoughts and half memories. There's another example. There's like, have you seen this man? And it was a famous, you might know it, but there's a man that exists in everyone's dreams, and he's got a very particular face. And what the guy actually did is he averaged every single description of a face out into one kind of DB Cooper looking dude.
Huh.
And the idea being that we subconsciously hold on to composites of multiple people. So I think that's an interesting theory for what the Greys are, because what else is a Grey but someone performing on us and doing close examinations? Yeah.
I know that the great UFO theorist, psychosocial theorist Martin Kottmeyer wrote a really interesting paper on why the color gray. And I mean, I've had my own theories, but you can probably go out and find that if people Google Martin Kottmeyer, why gray or something, they might be able to find that paper. But you're right, there's certainly a lot of theories on why these things look the way they do. And you're right, at first when you read Interrupted Journey, which has the book by Fuller, which has the transcripts of the hypnosis by Benjamin Simon, hypnotizing both Betty and Barney, they described all kinds of different ways. I think at one stage Barney says they've got big noses like Jimmy Durante, who was a famous comic with a big nose at the time. Now, who on earth today would say a Grey had a big nose? It's the reverse. They have just almost like skeletal noses. There's nothing really there. There's just holes. I think he at one stage describes them as red-headed Irishmen. At another stage, he says they're Nazis. They're dressed like Nazis. They look like Nazis. Betty at one stage says they look like mongoloid children, which is a politically incorrect term, but I think that's what she uses, because at the time she was working, I believe, in some type of social work capacity, and she had, she worked with children with disabilities. So when you read it, you can see all these different ideas spinning in their imaginations, and it does become somewhat cemented. And then later, who knows? And then later, of course, it becomes this kind of trope. I think Communion had a lot to do with popularizing it, that book cover as well. The famous Whitley Strieber cover with the thing with the big black eyes. I think that did an awful lot to cement the idea of what ETs look like. Close Encounters of the Third Kind did an awful lot to cement that idea of these childlike, thin-limbed, big-headed kind of beings as well. So there's a lot of stuff going on there. But certainly the interpretation that it might be some regressive memory we have from being babies born by doctors is as good as any of them. All of this stuff is wonderful to theorize about.
Oh, I do. I'm trying to think of cool Crisman stuff I can tell you.
Please do. I'd love to hear more.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I have a good one, which is the alibi that Crisman had by the principal that he worked under at Rainier High School during the event. And it said, "Sir, I can assure you that Fred Crisman was not at the grassy knoll. He was actually teaching that day. And I would also like to mention that I've caught him in a number of falsehoods." He uses the term a number of falsehoods. And he said that Crisman would wear an Air Force uniform to class and lecture the kids about discipline. I then found out he existed pre-Air Force. I don't know where he got the uniform from. He tried to start a secret student organization, which a lot of people believe was some sort of UFO club. It turned out to be more of a John Birch Society type deal. And so generally it sounded like the principal hated him. I mean, he was just a character. And I don't know, everyone has that uncle that Uncle Bob's going to say some stuff at the dinner table today. Uncle Bob's got some opinions on Obama right now, and we're just going to let him talk for 10 minutes.
So Crisman's radio show and his politics were to the political right, I'm guessing, from what you're saying.
That's my understanding, yeah. And he had a lot of not nice things to say about Kennedy, which is, I think, why he even got subpoenaed. There's a great news article that, it shows him getting subpoenaed, and then it says that he was upset that they didn't give him, like, room and board for the whole trip, and he wasn't flying out till they did. And then it says they flew him out.
Gosh.
So I really do think Crisman as a character is just fascinating. And
he is.
I interviewed his son for 3.5 hours, and I'm going to go back and interview him. This is a year later now, but I'm going to go interview him about it again. And I almost wanted to call the movie "My Dad Might Have Shot the President." I mean,
that's a great title.
Imagine, he was saying, like, imagine, he's like, this is my version of the internet. I would walk into a bookstore and I'd flip through it and check if my dad was mentioned. Like, that's how he was living his life at some point. He was, I believe, in middle school or high school when Kennedy died, and he was reading about his dad in the newspaper. I mean, imagine.
Jeez.
Yeah.
When do you think you'll have this film out? I'd love to have it at Midwest. I know it's not going to be ready for this year's, but I'd love to have it maybe for next year's or later. It sounds just fantastic.
Hopefully next year's. And I have a lot of stuff I could say about that too. Have you seen that Bill Murray documentary, or there was another documentary, Dear Mr. Watterson, about Calvin and Hobbes. Where I would argue my problem with Apu has it too, where it's like, I am someone with a voice, but I really love this celebrity, or I really hate this celebrity. I'm going to interview everyone about him and then try to meet them. I made sure that this documentary does not do that. I filmed myself a little bit. My friend actually tripped and snapped his ankle while we were at Maury Island.
Oh, gosh.
While we were filming. And
Deros.
we filmed
it was a Deros
exactly, it was all Deros. But I talked to a guy there who was sort of just watching the water. I'm like, have you heard of the Maury Island incident? And he goes, you guys just had a Maury Island incident. So all this weird stuff happened, but it didn't exactly happen to me. And I don't want to make a movie that says, my name is Bryan Shickley. I love, I do it like this. My name is Bryan Shickley, and I love Fred Crisman, and I want to tell his whole story. Watch me talk about myself and what I'm doing for 2.5 hours. So
sounds
I've got
like a
all
good
this
movie, man. I want to see that one.
I got all this footage of, Maury Island and my friend getting hurt, and it's not going to be me. It's not going to be my friend either. We're going to do it right now. The prevailing idea is a character named Mr. X or something like that, and it's a person that I'll green screen or I'll draw into the shot who will be investigating Crisman.
Huh.
And because Crisman's life's a little bit fiction, from what I understand of it, and I really like this idea that I'm going to give nothing but facts and I'll cite every source, but I don't want to be the narrator. I want this faceless person there because I want the spotlight to be on Crisman and the world around him.
That's interesting. That's one of the things I love about documentary, that there are so many different avenues. Like you can do the type of, I don't know what you would call it, the participatory type one where the documentarian is part of the story, or you can do an omnipresent type voice, or you can do just a cinema verite. You can handle documentary in so many different ways. And to do a documentary about Fred Crisman where there is so much mythology wrapped in his story, I think it's wonderful that you have these alternative, interesting ideas of approaching it, because it almost begs to be handled in a different kind of a way because of that blend of fact and fiction.
I think that's exactly it, and it's going to be a lot of fun. I actually have this Adobe just put this out, and you've probably heard of it. I think it's Adobe Podcast, and I'm working on using it to digitally restore audio clips from the 50s and the 60s.
Oh wow.
I'll show it to you. It's really remarkable.
Please do, because I was playing around with an audio recording that I need, which was from the 1950s, and I just was playing with it in Audacity and trying to use noise fill, and it's a lot cleaner than it would have been. But I'm sure if there's a program like that which is specifically for doing it, I bet you would do a better job than my limited knowledge of audio
you'll be
engineering.
Amazed how good it sounds, but it doesn't quite capture your S's. It'll sound like you have a little bit of a lisp. I've considered actually voicing it over and just adding the consonants back in. Or if not, just layer the two tracks and have a middle quality. But you'll have to hear it. It's remarkably good.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, please, let's talk after the show. How do people get how do people watch what you're doing? How do they see what you're up to, follow you on? Do you have any social media accounts or an official website or something?
I own fredcrisman.com, not bragging. So if you want to learn about Fred Crisman, FredCrisman.com. And that has right now just the movie trailer up. The movie should be coming out in a couple months publicly. And then I guess just my Twitter is Bryan Shickley, BryanShickley. And I do all sorts of stuff, just biographical comics, and I love weirdos and I love criminals, and I love people who, when you look at them, you're just not bored. And hopefully there will be a lot more Crisman stuff in the next 2 years.
Oh, I hope so. That'd be fantastic. So I can't wait to see what you do next. I can't wait for the Fred Crisman documentary. Keep in touch any ways you'll have to, because I'll be requiring materials from you for Midwest Weird Fest very shortly, which takes place March 3 to 5 at the Micon Downtown Cinema in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And anybody within cooey distance of the Micon and Eau Claire, I would encourage them to come along to see Fred Crisman, Cave of the Space Nazis, along with dozens of other short films and probably 15 or more features. It's a heck of a weekend, and it's a heck of a lot of fun. I need to try to twist your arm, Bryan, into coming out to the festival.
I might show up. That sounds like a lot of fun. This will be one of 3 I've gone to, so.
Oh wow! No, come, you'll have a blast. It really is it's just a fun, intimate festival. We have an incredible audience who really get this type of cinema, and there's always a bunch of filmmakers there. I guarantee you'll have a blast if you come.
All right.
But thanks so much for coming on. It was great having you on the show.
Oh, thank you for having me, man. It's fun to talk about Crisman.
It sure was, and Palmer and Shaver, my favorite topics at the moment. And until I talk to you again, until I see everybody else out there, keep it weird.